And a very good evening to you, and welcome to this evening's edition of Politics 101. Welcome to all of you, wherever you're joining us from. Please, of course, share the link and let everyone know that we are on tonight. And good evening to all of you, whether you're joining us from inside, from Guyana itself, as where I am. Um, as you all know, this is my time, one of the times of the year that I spend here, and I'll be here um, for the next couple of months, um, spending my time between um, doing the show and spending my time on the ground doing activist work. Um, and it's always got to be home. Welcome to all of you who are joining us from Guyana. Um, those of you who are joining us from outside of Guyana, welcome. We had quite a good show last night. I got some good feedback. Um, WPA Groundings with Takuma Ogunse. Some frank discussions on the issue of race and ethnicity and politics and so forth. Um, and some good feedback. Good evening to all of you. Of course, we come on tonight in a kind of a split decision. The court today handed down uh, the ruling um, on the case that was brought in relation to the voters list for the local government election. And the Chief Justice continues to maintain that there's not much can be done with the voters list unless the necessary legislation is passed to to clean the voters list. And she felt that the information provided to the court by Carol Joseph and the PNC did not. I've been trying to get Carol to see if we could get her on tonight, but I haven't been able to get her. And so she felt that there was not enough there to prevent the list from being used for the upcoming election. And as regards the second case, and this is the case with the boundaries, where the minister redrew the boundaries, and GCOM admitted that the minister did not have the authority to redraw boundaries. But then GCOM went on to use the same boundaries that were redrawn by the minister. And of course, APNU/PNC went to court, and the Attorney General and the Vice President, two of the three-man party, you know, that's what we have now dubbed the PPP, a three-man party. So Jagdeo and Nandlal sought to be added to the case. And the Chief Justice today said it was not necessary for them to be added to the case because this is a case that is brought against GCOM, and GCOM is an independent body, and so she did not permit them to become part of the case. She is going to hand down the ruling on that case on Wednesday, because as you know, voting begins on Friday. The joint services are scheduled to start voting on Friday. And if the court rules that GCOM was out of order in using the gerrymandered boundaries, the gerrymandered constituencies, that could delay the elections, could postpone the elections. So she argued, from based on the reports, the Chief Justice felt that if the AG and the Vice President were added, it would delay the case. And that was their intention, to delay the case so that voting would start. Justice did not allow that. So she's going to hand down a ruling on Wednesday. So that's where we are on the front of the court. We also, I think, read in the papers today the shocking news that some PNC members in Lancaster area there on the quarantine were removing PPP posters and flags that were put up in their village. And the police were called, and the police are seeking to question the people and talking about bringing charges. Since when you cannot take down posters? That is normal politics. That is normal politics. Why is the police getting involved in that? Good evening, and welcome to Politics 101. Welcome to Politics 101. We are really, and I want us to realize where we are headed in Guyana. We cannot wait until we are buried to say we told you so. We are telling you in real time, we are not headed to a good place in our country. We are not headed to a good place. The PPP is determined to continue down the path they're going. They're determined. There's no stopping. There's no stopping. We have said a long time ago that governments work effectively when there are checks and balances, because we human beings, by our very nature, when we are given power, by our very nature, when we are given power, the inclination is to misuse power. And that is why political systems have checks. And there are no checks on PPP's power, no institutional checks. And I have theorized and argued on this program that once you have regime change, the institutional checks are removed. And that is in effect what we have in Guyana. What are the institutional checks? The executive is checked by the court, the judicial branch of government, and they're particularly checked by the legislative branch of government. That the other two branches of government have the power to check the third branch of government. In our winner-take-all system, the parliament, although theoretically should be a check on the government, in a real practical sense, it's not a check. Because the government is usually the party with a majority in parliament. And unless there is some uproar within the party in parliament is not going to check the party in the executive branch. In fact, members of the executive branch sit in the legislative branch. So you have people sitting in two branches of government. The ministers are sitting in the executive branch and they're also in the legislative branch. So the legislative branch doesn't get to check. But the understanding is that the opposition would be granted some latitude in parliament to serve as a check on the government. So they set up, for example, these sectoral committees that are chaired by opposition members. What the PPP has done is that it has used its power to render these sectoral committees useless, powerless. They don't turn up to meetings. They change the rules to ensure that if they don't turn up, there is no quorum. And so the little latitude within the system that the opposition had in parliament, the PPP has taken that away. So the parliament is theoretically and practically not a check on the government. So there's not that institutional check. The court, because of the way in which it got itself, in my estimation, overly entangled in the politics. The court, there was the risk of the court not being a check. Recently, we have seen the court asserting itself and saying to the executive branch, no, 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 no. So there's some hope there. But the fact that they have not regularized the Chief Justice, the fact that they have not regularized the Chancellor, the fact that Jack Dio and them are shouting at the court when the court doesn't rule in their favor, they're undermining the independence of the court. So the court is a kind of shaky. So institutionally, there is little check on the government, institutionally. What are the other checks? The other check is the ability of the opposition to act outside of the formal system to serve as a check on the government. There's a kind of balance of power between the two parties. the PNC, whenever it's out of office, always use its ability to put people on the streets as a check on the government. A lot of times it doesn't even have to put people on the street. The very potential of the street power of the PNC served as a check on the PPP government. And when the PPP is in opposition, it uses its control of the agriculture sector and its control of the business sector as a check on PNC governments. So we saw when the coalition was in office, the business people, the mainly Indian business sector, kind of undermined the government. They didn't invest much. They didn't employ too many people. So they undermined the economy. They used their clout in the business sector. In the old days, the sugar workers would go on strike regularly as a means of undermining the PNC government. So both parties had what is called extra parliamentary ways of checking the government. So if you're a PPP government and you're about to do certain things, you're always wondering, my God, is the PNC going to put people on the streets? I better not do this. And if the PNC is in office, it's always wondering whether the business sector is going to undermine it, whether the sugar workers, because we depended a lot on revenue from sugar and revenue from commerce. So they had a way of economically, and it's what you call the balance of power. What has happened since 2020 is that the PNC's ability to use the street as a check on the government has been wiped away. On this program and all the other programs, people have been calling for boots on the ground. And the PNC has not been able to put boots on the ground for varying reasons. One reason, of course, is the fear that the marches, the demonstrations would be infiltrated, and that's one. Two, the Americans now have big investment and they don't want, and I'm sure they would have told the PNC, be careful with that street thing. So for all intents and purposes, street power as a check on the government is gone. The other check on government is the way the armed forces, any government in a country, is always worried about what the armed forces will do in any country. In our situation, the armed forces are generally of one ethnic group. And in the old days, the PPP used to be very concerned about the army and the police, and if they go too far. And the army and the police has never had to move against any government. Because governments, both PNC, not the PNC so much because of the ethnic composition, but the PPP was very careful not to push things too far. So the army and the police never had to intervene in Guyana. And the PPP was always concerned about that threat. What has happened again since 2020 is that the PPP has neutralized the leadership of the army and the police by putting their people in the leadership of the forces. How do we know that? Ask Paul Slow. And Paul Slow said the president called him and told him who he want to be promoted. So the formula that the PPP has come up with to neutralize the army and the police is to control the leadership, to make sure that those who are in the leadership of those forces are people who are loyal to them. And in my estimation, I think they've done a good job of that. And so the police and the army are no longer a potential check on the excesses of the government. The government does what it's like, and it doesn't have to fear that the army and the police would move against it. So the military check is gone. The street check is gone. The institutional check in the parliament is gone. Some of the judicial check has gone. And I said some because the court has now begun to, get itself back. The other check is civil society check. These are civil society, are usually the people in the society, the well-to-do people in the society, the rich people in the society, the elites in the society. And they serve as an important check in any society because they have money, they have influence by virtue of their status in the society, they have overseas connections. So governments are generally very wary of civil society. Very wary of civil society. But in a country like Guyana, the civil society itself is racially divided. So we have the Indian civil society is not pushing back against government excesses. And the African civil society is ambivalent. So the civil society check is not as strong as it should be. Now, recently, some of the civil society has begun to be pushed back, like, for example, on the issue of oil, the civil society is very vocal. But generally, the civil society check has been weakened. What about the media? The media is another very powerful check on government. The media would expose corruption, expose wrongdoing of the government. Well, the media got itself tangled up in the 2020 election. It took partisan positions, and I'm talking about the independent media, the privately owned media. And so what has happened since 2020 election is that the media have been weakened. They have been very cautious about exposing the government. Again, recently we have seen, like on the oil issue, some movement in the media. And you can always know when institutions are pushing back. The government comes out swinging against them. And we saw the government come out swinging against the media, swinging against civil society, swinging against the courts. What it means is that those checks are beginning to show some life. But I think as we speak today, those institutions are still weakened. And finally, the international check. Any government in the so-called third world is always concerned about what the Americans think, what the British, the Europeans think, because those are the powerful countries. And if you were here in the Western Hemisphere, it's the Americans and to some extent the British, you know. And because, again, the Americans and the Europeans took sides in the election, and, you know, the Americans intervened on one side before the elections was over, it is clear where the political preferences are. So the PPP doesn't fear that the Americans will move against them. So that international check is removed. So we basically have a government without checks. No checks and balances. The areas that would normally check a government, they're not there. So what we have is government that has gone amok, says what it likes, does what it likes. And one last important check, and that is the support base of any government. If your support base holds you accountable, and you're accountable to them, they then serve as a check. But the PPP is not accountable to its own support base. Why? Because its support base is ethnic. Ethnic. That means that the support base will know the government is doing wrong, but they wouldn't come out against the government because they would feel that if they do so, they would undermine their own ethnic government. So they're prepared to see the government do wrong, and they wouldn't serve as a check against the government. So all the areas that would normally prevent the government from misbehaving, those areas are weakened. So at best, what we have in Guyana are weakened checks. At worst, no check. So we have a government that has gone amok. The balance of power, the ethnic balance of power shifted. Indians control the commercial sector, the business sector. They own the business sector, the commercial sector. The majority of wealth lies there. They control the political government. Via the PPP. And the political government has now neutralized the political opposition, and it has neutralized the armed forces. So the threat of manners in the PPP is gone. And I know it's very difficult for opposition supporters to come to grips with that. I've been saying it for these last 3 years, but it's when you're one person saying it, or two people, or just a few people saying it, people say, yeah, you're right. But you know, it doesn't dawn on them because we're accustomed to checks and balances. So it's difficult to come to grips that there are no checks and balances. So we're saying, why the Guyanese people not standing up? Why the opposition is not doing this? And those are legitimate questions. But that's not how politics work. Yes, at some point, the ordinary citizen, out of frustration, will rise up. At some point. At some point, if the formal opposition doesn't act, other actors will act. So that will come. But you have to understand why the normal brakes on the government are not there. Because it's a different kind of government. It's an installed government. And so an installed government has the cover that an elected government doesn't have. This government doesn't fear that it will lose votes. It doesn't fear that the armed forces will move against it. It doesn't fear that the opposition will put its people on the road and undermine it. It doesn't fear. It doesn't fear going to election because what? It has used its power to capture GECOM. And GECOM is the body that's responsible for elections. And at the level of the commission, the government has a 4-3 majority. The PPP has a 4-3 majority. And they use that 4-3 majority to hire the staff at GECOM that is going to do their bidding. So GECOM is gone. So the opposition has no guarantee of free and fair elections. There's no guarantee. Because we know we live in a country where rigged elections are have always been the order of the day. Poor PNC, they're the ones who got stuck with it. But the rest of us knew the PPP were rigging elections all these times. Some of us, you know, as Brother Ogunse said last night, it might have been a mistake for some of us in the WPA, for example, the WPA, that we didn't expose the PPP rigging in the same way that we exposed the PNC rigging in the old days. And so the country comes to think that rigging only occurred one place. Rigging has always been occurred. So the easiest thing to do in Guyana is to rig an election. We learned that in 2020. If we didn't know it before, we know it in 2020. We learned it in 2020. And control of GECOM is always important to rigging. Because when you finish doing the rigging on the ground, GECOM has to now validate the rigging. And that is what GECOM did in 2020. It validated the PPP rigging. Don't worry the PNC. Even if you believe the PPP saying the PNC attempted to rig. See? They're not saying the PNC rigged because there's no evidence from any of the observers that before election day, the PNC attempted to rig. There's no evidence. And I can tell you, as someone who was on the ground on election day, on the East Coast, going in PNC/opposition stronghold, there was no rigging on election day. No instructions came down to rig. And the PPP knows that. So there's no evidence of PNC rigging in 2020. If you believe the PPP, they're saying there was an attempt to rig. You know, you have to prove that attempt, and that is what the petitions are there. But even without a petition, because of the recount, we were able to get a view of PPP rigging in process. And you see, be careful what you ask for, yeah? The PPP went to the court and said, look, we think the PNC is rigging. And the court said, well, GCOM can fix this rigging if it's going on. And GCOM then made a law, the recount law, which many people feel itself was unconstitutional. That GCOM overstepped its boundaries, its power, by ordering a recount. But you see, if the PP, if they didn't order the recount, they would have had to declare the results that were in, and that would have given the coalition victory. Because there are those 10 declarations from the 10 regions that were there. And those 10 declarations would have given the victory to the coalition. So the recount overrode the 10 declarations. And many people think that was unconstitutional. But in its unconstitutionality, in its attempt, well, not attempt, in its embrace of the unconstitutional recount, this unconstitutional recount opened a minefield. And the minefield is the PPP rigging. So if one followed the logic of the recount, you could not declare a winner. So what GCOM had to do was to say, yes, we had a recount, to audit the votes. But now the recount has shown that rigging occurred under our watch. We are now in a bind. And so what GCOM ended up doing was to declare an election for a winner with known and glaring thievery. GCOM declared an election with full knowledge of the thieving. Remember, as the recount is going on and the thieving is uncovered, on the first couple of days, the GCOM said, don't put that in the compute, put it one side. You know, you get mango and some of them spile, you put the spile on them one side. And she was doing that. And at some point, she stopped doing that. She put back the spile mango in there. And so GCOM ended up certifying a rigged election. That is why they fear a court, a real court case, objective, would overturn the 2020 election. But the court itself finds itself in a bind because the court aided and abetted what GCOM did. So the court itself became entangled in the web of slackness that occurred in 2020. And so rigging what 2020 did. For the first time, both parties, see, the PNC always knew the PPP rig. They always knew, hey, that is known. And the PPP always know that the PNC rigging. They know. But they never confronted each other. And in 2020, the PPP said, well, we see like you're trying a thing. And the PNC said, you see like we trying a thing? Well, we know you already try a thing and we're going to expose you. That is what happened in 2020. So GECOM is now under the control of the PPP. And we know the PPP knows how to rig before election day. That's their forte. They're skillful at that. I don't think the PNC could match the PPP skill at rigging before election day. It's an art that the PPP has mastered, because all these decades, while the PPP is saying, look, the PPP, the PNC encouraging multiple voting, while they're putting our attention on PNC election day story, they're doing their story long before election. They're rigging below the surface. So they have had decades of practice at that. And it's now out in the open in a real freaky way. Because what happened in 2020 with that recount is freaky. Had there not been a recount, the coalition would have had to be declared a winner. To not declare the coalition a winner, you have to invent a law called the recount. The recount, not setting out to do that, then expose the PPP. So the PPP is now in control of GECOM. And GECOM is going to certify the rigging in this local government election, if and when it occurs. The way you overcome rigging before election day is that you have to have a game plan to have so many votes on election day to nullify the rigging before election day. Even with the rigging, the PPP just had a 2-seat majority. People say 1 seat, but the seat with them little parties is a PPP seat. So basically, they win with a 2-seat majority with massive rigging before election day. It meant that at the PNC being able to put 20,000, 15,000 more voters out on election day, it could have overcome the rigging. And that is where the regime change came in. Because the regime change was always in the PPP back pocket, just in case the PNC was going to overcome the rigging. Regime change would have nullified all of that. So rigging and regime change, that's what you had. The combination of rigging and regime change, the 2 R's, is what happened in 2020. And even if I don't know that the PNC attempted, as the PPP said, I'm waiting to see what the courts will say about that. Whether, in fact, as the PPP is saying, the PNC attempt to rig. Attempt. attempt. That's what they're saying. Whether that is true or not, with the massive PPP rigging and the regime change, I don't think even an attempt to rig would have saved the day. And so here we are in 2023. When you add on top of all I'm saying, the removal of checks and balances, the control of the electoral machinery, which means that you're now controlling rigging. You have the mechanism by which you can now validate rigging. On top of all of that, you now have money. Plenty money in a poor country. Another aspect of rigging is going on, and that is to buy an election. That is why all over the world you have campaign finance, to prevent parties from buying elections, buying votes. And buying votes is don't look, even in Barbados, Mr. Clean Barbados, 2 elections ago, I think, they found that the parties were buying votes, going into the poor areas and buying votes. I'm saying that in elections all over the world, rigging is normative. What you do with the clean machinery is you minimize the rigging. But rigging is normative in America, in Barbados, all over. The people do all kinds of things to get votes. What most countries are able to do is to minimize the rigging so that it does not affect the outcome of the election. And what we could not do in 2020 was to minimize the rigging. Why? Because the very basis of the rigging is the voters list. The voters list. Minefield. You have over 200,000 extra names on that list to buy. And here's why I say buy. Because those names got ID cards attached to them. A lot of them are people who are dead or people who gone overseas. And if you're dead, you left an ID card. If you go overseas, you drop your ID card off of the PPP headquarters. So in effect, you are buying those 200,000 votes by buying the ID cards attached to them. So that's one form of vote buying that the PPP is master. That's why the PPP is not going to change that list until it is forced to. And the court is saying, we can force it. I think the court could force it if it wants to, but our court is not there yet. The court pushes it to the legislature, but the legislature is controlled by the PPP. And the PNC says, let's do house-to-house registration. And what the PPP does, use its power in the legislature to ban house-to-house registration. So all the efforts to clean this list have gone to naught. The court washes its hand. It said that is not my story. That's the legislature. The legislature is controlled by the PPP. They say, you think we can clean a list that we are benefited from? No. So the legislature can do nothing. What about house-to-house registration? Well, the PPP said yes, but we can ban it, and they ban it. That's the bind that the PNC found itself in this local government election. The PPP controls GCOM. The list is porous as hell. And whatever the PPP does is going to be validated by GCOM. The PNC is not able to bring its friends to say, come and observe the election, because the PNC has no friends. The PPP bought all the friends. Whether it's CARICOM, Commonwealth, ABCE, all those friends who go all over the world and certify elections, they're PPP friends. Observers certify elections. They go into a country and they say, well, we like this contestant, so we're going to just verify the elections, and they have power to do so. And the PPP was able to influence those powers. And those powers, in a sense, the observers themselves are compromised. You're an American observer. You come to a country to observe elections in that country. But you have American investment in that country. So you are not going to be objective as an observer. You are not going to be objective. Because you are going to call the election for the party that your economic interests have confidence in. So you an American, you come here to observe from the Carter Center. You are not going to call an election for the party that Exxon doesn't favor. So the observers themselves are compromised because it represents an interest. So I'm painting this picture here tonight to say to you all what we politicians don't like to say to our supporters. Because politicians don't like to give their supporters the thing that all is lost. No, all is not lost in the final analysis. But as I'm speaking to you now, I am saying the opposition is at a massive disadvantage in Guyana. The street power that Hoyt was able to use in 1998, after the 1997 election, the PNC said, the PPP thief the election, the lady take the thing, she throw it over her shoulder, Mrs. Jagan. And Hoyt said, all right, I'm going to give you slow fire. And when they weren't bucking to the slow fire, he said, more fire. Because he had fire. He had the street power. Yes, he didn't have the Americans with him. He didn't have the parliament with him. But he had street power. And he was able to put 10,000 people per day on the streets. At the end, the PPP got 2 years. He get them to cut off 2 out of their 5 years. He get them to agree to constitutional reform because he had street power. The PNC does not have street power. The WPA got a belly, as the WPA showed recently. They got a belly bottom. But they don't have street power. Or I should say we, because I belong to the WPA. Regime change has wiped away the street power of the opposition. Is all lost? No, all is not lost. I'm not saying that. I'm saying tonight to tell you all is lost. I'm saying what I'm saying tonight to say this is the reason why we got to up the fight and keep it up. When nothing is in your favor, that's the time you should fight more. That's the point I'm making here tonight. Not to down your spirit, but to tell you the truth. Because politicians don't always like to say the truth, because to say the truth is to make you look weak. Man, Norton come in, and we expect Norton to put boots on the ground, and so on and so on. And Norton now got to come and say, well, man, I can't put boots on the ground because it's so he's not going to do that. It takes messengers like me to tell you all the truth. And I'm not telling you all the truth, like I said, to say go home and sleep and give up. Telling you the truth so that you fight more. The PPP has money. And it's using that money not for development. It's using that money to entrench itself in power. All those people who are defecting, going to the PPP, it's money. It's an impoverished country. And money matters to people. I love the PNC. But God, they're dangling some money to me. And the human element kicks in. As I said last night, what opposition supporters are getting is not pepper pot. They're getting sergeant. There's a pepper pot water. You cook pepper pot Friday, and you sell out the pepper pot. All the meat sell out by Wednesday. The pepper pot water left, the broth. In boxing, we used to call it sergeant, because all the captains and the majors and the brigadiers gone. There's the meat. Don't sell out. The pepper pot water, we used to call it sergeant. A sergeant and bread Wednesday night, 8 cents. It used to be 25 cents in those days for good pepper pot. You got first cut. And it's folk wisdom. When you don't drink and so on, you going home at 2 o'clock in the morning. We ain't getting microwave in them time. You start by first cut. Cut. What you get? He said, buy, teacher, when we get a stray, buy food. Eat at your own risk. Sergeant and bread, 8 cents. The cook-up will cook Wednesday night and Thursday night and get the nice tripe and pigtail and so on. You gotta go Friday and Saturday, forget that. During the week, you stray buy food. And what the PPP is giving, those people are going over stray buy food. Sergeant, they're getting stray buy food. But they're comparing what they're getting with the nothing that they didn't have. They're not comparing what they're getting with what the others are getting. Worse yet, the PNC can't stop it. They cannot stop their own people from going over. It's not just, people are always trying to buy people. But in the old days, the PNC, the PPP dare not try that. But they could try it in 2023 because of regime change. Because the PNC can't stop them. My friend Hammy Green brought Patricia Chase into politics. He can't stop she from going over. Look, Ronald Baker. He said, and he's talking the truth. He worked with Armand. Armand can't stop it. The PNC, the opposition, cannot stop its people from being raided by the slave catchers. It shows the weakened state. It shows how the balance of power has changed. The PPP doing as it's like because there are no checks and balances. The bad boys them, the PPP control the bad boys them. Going to the black villages, black communities, it controlling the bad boys. So every facet Again, I'm saying this here tonight, not to frighten you all and not to give you all dung spirit. It's to say to you all, this is the state where we're in. And I can say it. I can say it. The big party is not likely to say it. I can say it. And this is the value of a politics of diversity. A person like myself, a party like the WPA, we can come to you all and level with you all. Because we don't have much to lose by leveling with you all. So that's where we are today. And we are going into an election. You know what it is for a PNC to be worrying whether it will win Georgetown? The very fact that you're worrying. No, some of us believe that the PNC wouldn't lose Georgetown. But that's besides the point. The very fact that we have to say that points to how much things have changed. Politics at the end of the day is about power. The ability to get people to do things they would not normally do. That is one definition of politics. And the PPP is getting some PNC members to do things that they would not normally do. That is to cross over. In the old days, you couldn't leave the PPP and go over to the PNC and go back in an Indian village and sleep nicely and lightly. They'll give you hell in those Indian villages. You couldn't live there. Now people are crossing and going back in their community and sleep well. They're going and drink with people, going around. I am not saying that people should do people anything. What I'm saying is that when the balance of power was there, people wouldn't even think about crossing over. But there's no balance of power. You know that if you cross over, you're not losing anything. You're not paying a price for it. I remember in the village, when the PNC and WPA were at it and so on, you know, WPA had the upper hand. And even them children used to give PNC leaders in the village hell. They would come and complain to me and other WPA activists. We had to go and talk to people, say, no, don't do teacher that. You know, yes, she's PNC and so on, but we had to talk to them young people. Because there was a price to be paid. There was a price to be paid. If you were on the wrong side in a particular village, and in Boston in those days, if you were PNC, you were considered on the wrong side. Because, you know, the PNC, the Boston was always seen as WPAs. So the PNC were seen as on the wrong side, and they would get hell. Nobody would do anybody anything physically. The children would call them all kind of names. People refused to drink with them and so on and things. Yeah. But no, you can go over to the other side with no sanction. It shows how much powerless we have become. How much powerless we've become. And so that's what we're up against. What that means is that we've got to up our struggle. Those of us who have the courage, because we have to understand the majority of people are going to say, in this atmosphere, I have to protect the individual. So people now are no longer protecting the party. People have now saying, boy, this thing get bad. I got to protect the individual. If my daughter walking in a ministry, I got to protect she. Because if she lose her job, then we ain't got no income. So people are no longer protecting the party and protecting the race and protecting the struggle. They're protecting the victim. It doesn't mean that they no longer support us. It doesn't mean that. What it means that in a situation where the institution and the race can protect us, we got to protect, we said. That's what the individual African is saying. I'm supporting you all, but you all can no longer guarantee my protection for that support. You all can no longer stop Jack Yoder from knocking off my daughter. You all can no longer stop Jack Dio from knocking off my son. This is the individualist reasoning. I know it. I walk around. And people are telling me two things. A couple of days, I'm here. I move around. Keep up the fight, Doc. And then they lower their voice. Be careful, though. They recognize the need to fight. But they also recognize that we are living under a ruthless regime. Keep up the fight, Doc, but be careful. And you know it. You know it when the women, because often it's the women in our community, got to wash with clothes, got to take care of us. The women, young women, or the older women, but the young ones who are seeing people like me on the street. David, be careful. I grew up in a family, after 50 years of me being own way, meaning being in politics, and my brother, my elder brother, was involved up to a certain point and he's no longer involved. So my family accustomed to living with this danger of me being involved in politics. And I stopped in Maryland for my niece's graduation. And all of them, I said, David, you sure? You sure you sure you're going to Guyana? I've never, it's not that my family, my siblings, my mother and them they were always concerned, but they always supported me. So they never tried to dissuade. But this time, all of them, and these are not political people. They're asking me, David, you sure? You sure? 3-4 times a day, they're contacting me. You okay? Were you there? Were you all right? There's a recognition that the race can't defend us anymore. The party can't defend us anymore. So the individual has to look out for himself, on herself. And some of them decide to go up on the other side. A tiny minority. But the majority of them are saying, we got to protect the individual. Where does that leave us? We need leaders with belly bottom now. We need leaders with belly bottom now. Because it's belly bottom going to carry us through this. You hear what Jack Dio said to the WPA? Once you lock them up, they're going to retreat. He said that when they were telling the police to lock up Ogunse. He said, watch, once you lock them up, they're going to retreat. That's the way they think about it, because they're ruthless. The fellas that are in charge of the PPP, they're ruthless. The three-man party, they're ruthless, those three men. They're ruthless. They will draw blood to hold power. That's what we're dealing with, my brothers and sisters. And so more than ever, we need your support. Those of you who are brave enough to come out into the open, come out into the open. And those of you who are not brave enough, give me the support from the back, because we are in the fight of our lives. We're fighting for the race. We're fighting for the opposition, which includes more than just Africans. It includes rebellious Indians, rebellious Amerindians, rebellious Portuguese. So we're fighting for the race, we're fighting for the opposition, and ultimately we're fighting for our share, our fair share of our country. Fight of our lives. All of a sudden we are naked. We can't depend on the police and the army leadership to push back. The rank and file is different, but the leadership of the army and the police, we can't depend on them to do what army and police do. That is to be neutral and to stand on the side of the just and the powerless. We can't depend on the leadership of the army to do that. And the police, we can't depend on that leadership to do the right things. We can't depend on the party. The party is weakened, and when you weaken a party, we cussing and fighting one another, as is happening in the major party, the major opposition party. So the party can't defend us. Our so-called kith and kin in the leadership of the armed forces can't defend us. Our church, the black church, has always been a force. But the black church in Guyana is compromised. So the church can't defend us. The institutions which we depended on to defend us when marauders are at the door are not defending us today. That is why those three men, that three-man party, is doing what it's doing. There are no checks. There's nobody to hold them back. There's nobody to point the finger and say, not one more step. No. I say all of that to say that we've got to press on. Can't give up now. We can't give up now. With all the obstacles, with everything that is against us, we still have to press forward. This is not normal politics. And those politicians who are telling you that this is normal politics, not normal politics. We just finished independence. And I was glad to hear all the politicians saying there's nothing to celebrate. I hear some of the politicians saying we got to fight for Guyana. We have to fight for our share of Guyana force. Because we got to be in Guyana to fight for Guyana. We got to be off Guyana to fight for Guyana. The slave had to fight for his freedom first. The oppressed today has to fight for our freedom first. This nonsense about Guyana, this Guyana. And black people like to practice, especially middle class and educated. Sophisticated nonsense. You have to fight for yourself first. How you gonna save Guyana if you can't save your group? Can't save your family? Can't save your organizations? How you gonna save Guyana? Black people, especially you all educated ones, you all gotta get real. We got some young middle class, very educated, very ambitious young people, black young people, and I admire them. But a lot of them are too damn selfish. They're thinking about themselves. They'd rather eat sergeant and be satisfied with that rather than aim for the pepper pot. Excellent young people, bright. Some of them are business people. But the error is that they're too damn selfish, not realizing this is a time to fight for the self, but the self will not survive if the self is not part of something larger. I'm not into politics. I looking after me, I got to eat the food. The mouth is muzzled by the food it eats, says Martin Carter. The mouth is muzzled by the food it eats. You force, you can't talk properly. Choke you. I'm not saying that our young people must not demand of this government and this country. You must demand. You must demand. I'm not saying you shouldn't demand. No more than ever you must demand. But you must understand that the tree and the forest are interconnected. I'm talking here tonight primarily to black people, but to opposition supporters in general. We are up against it. This too shall pass. I am confident about that. I've seen enough to know that this too shall pass, but it will not pass without effort. People like myself know my role. I know my role. We know our role, but we cannot perform that role without your support. You all have to acknowledge and empower the various actors. It's hard for me to say to people, come support me. You know, it don't sound right. You know, it's not, it don't sound right. So I'm saying you all have to support and empower all your soldiers, because that's what we are, soldiers for justice and freedom. And I don't mind hierarchy. Don't bother me. If you all feel that some soldiers, they come from what you call big party, that don't bother me. We have got to press on. And we are going to press on. Let not your heart be troubled by what I said here tonight. Let your heart be gladdened that somebody has spoken the truth, taking all the varnish off, not to frighten you, but to let you know we got to fight hard. I hope history will absolve us if we fight hard. I love you all. Tomorrow night, I'm going to have a guest on tomorrow night to chat. I'm not telling you the guest name is a her, it's a she, because I don't want people to prejudge. So tomorrow night, we're going to be back at it. I'm going to have my guest on. I've been wanting to bring that guest on for a long time. She's going to be on tomorrow night. And I want you all to show her the love, because now is not the time to hate your own. Good night.